So you may have seen my video where I tried PoE2 as a D4 player. And well, since then, I've played through the PoE2 campaign numerous times with each update. And even though I said I'd still play D4 for each season, I actually ended up skipping everything after making my comparison video in Season 7. So this leaves me with the question of whether my general conclusion that I could personally see myself continuing to enjoy both games is actually true or not. But before I jump back into D4, there have been some meaningful changes to PoE2 that I'd like to take a moment to go over. First off, I said the maps were about a third bigger than they should be, and well, the maps are probably still a bit too large, but you can teleport between checkpoints, and there's a new sprint mechanic that I kinda like. Some players really didn't like it, and I can understand why. I think we all were expecting it to just be a faster move speed, but in actuality, they changed the move mechanics so that when you sprint, you can't stop or make sharp turns and you have to continually move forward. So basically, you have to steer around like you're in a boat, and if you bump into an obstacle or are hit by an enemy, it knocks you down. And honestly, I had a bit of a WTF moment myself the first time I tried it, but over time, it started to grow on me, and now I think I like it. And that's for two major reasons. One, it's not tied to stamina or a cooldown like most other games. There's no limitation to how far or long you run, just as long as you have the space and maneuverability to keep it up. Just like how I loved how the dodge roll doesn't have a cooldown, this is another S-tier decision in my book. Second, since it's not just a faster movement buff, but it actually is a totally different type of movement, it kind of turns the downtime of running through empty parts of the map into a sort of mini-game, where you can try to hug the curves and plot your course to maximize the distance you can run without bumping into anything. Maybe it's just me, but I find it strangely satisfying. And next up, they also added an in-game marketplace. And now, you were able to trade items in PoE2 before as well, but it requires you to message the player and work out when you can meet them at their hideout in real time, and for a somewhat antisocial introvert like myself, it kinda sucked. Now with the Abyssal League update, however, you can search in-game for your items, and when you find something you want, you can teleport directly to the player's hideout with a single click and purchase the item right away by just picking it up and putting it into your inventory, regardless of whether or not the seller is there or even online at all. You don't even have to talk to them, which once again is great for introverts like me. Also, I think crafting in PoE2 is still more RNG than Diablo 4, but there have been some additions to help give you a bit more control. Fractured Orbs now lets you lock in a modifier so that it doesn't change when you re-roll the item. And they've also split up kind of tiers of modifiers, so you can have regular, greater, and perfect, which you can target via their respective orbs. Also, at least for the Abyssal League, you're able to reserve a mod slot that you can then take to the Well of Souls, where you are given a couple of options to choose from. So all in all, these do give you a bit more control, but when you consider how Diablo 4 already gives you tempering, which allows you to choose a modifier from recipes you collect in the game, along with being able to just outright replace specific modifiers through the occultist, I think that what I said in my original comparison of PoE2 versus DO4 video about PoE2's crafting being more RNG dependent, while D4 is a bit more deterministic, still stands for the most part. Also, there is a whole new act with new bosses that are challenging but a lot of fun, and all in all, I gotta say, PoE2 is shaping up to be a pretty good game. So that being said, it's time to find out what it feels like stepping off that high plateau of PoE2's Abyssal League and coming back down into the world of Diablo 4. Okay, right off the bat, one thing that felt off to me is just how little your weapon choice seems to matter. PoE2's weapons actually changed the way you played. There was a very different feel to using a spear and a buckler versus a shield and a mace. Whereas in Diablo 4, it feels like essentially the weapons are just stat sticks to buff up your skills. This is a small complaint that most other people probably wouldn't care that much about, but having just played a Huntress in PoE2 where I was really leaning into the spear and parry build with a very tactile nature to that combat, I just wanted something a bit more grounded and crunchy. Rogue was too fast-paced, and Spiritborn was just too bright and colorful with its high saturated colors and showy effects. So I ended up just equipping a Necro with a longsword, which I coupled with the Reap skill, just so it would kind of look like I was swinging the sword when I used the skill. It's really just an aesthetic thing, But at least this way I could try to push into an undead knight sort of archetype for my build. The next major difference I felt was the severely limited choices when it comes to picking my skills. In PoE2, I really felt like I could come up with some random concept for a build and let that guide my progression. But in D4, it felt like there wasn't a lot of options to truly deviate from what appears to be a set of 3 or 4 themes that have been clearly set up for each class. Now I should counter though that it's not like there's no customization. You could probably play 3 to 5 times per class with very different gameplay experiences if you choose to embrace different parts of the skill tree. Also, there are legendary aspects that affect your skills in very meaningful ways that can drastically switch things up, and all in all, that's probably more than enough replayability for your average gamer. But for those of you looking for a very deep ARPG with a lot of longevity, compared to PoE2, this area does feel a bit lacking. In terms of progression, a big difference is that D4 allows you to skip the campaign, while PoE2 doesn't. Replaying both games, I think I can see why each game chose that design. D4's campaign is slower paced, with a lot of cutscenes and cinematics that are very compelling in your first playthrough, but would probably grow stale over time. But PoE2's campaign is in itself built to be a sort of guided leveling experience, leading you from map to map in a largely linear progression with little to no backtracking. That being said, playing PoE2 now with Act 4 and the interlude section before the endgame, it did start feeling like the campaign was getting a bit long, and I kind of found myself wishing I could skip it, at least maybe once per league in case you want to make some ults. But at any rate, I had already completed the D4 campaign way back at release, and since the purpose of this playthrough was to get a feel for what new players would be experiencing, I decided not to skip it this time and actually to play through from the start. And well, I gotta say, even without skipping the campaign, I was pleasantly surprised at just how many options you have for how you want to approach your playthrough. You can just follow the main quest objectives and run through the campaign linearly, but it seems to be really designed to have these moments where you just run into distractions on your way. You'll see these little mini events going on in the world map, and you have NPCs calling out to you with dialogue that kind of tempts you into a side quest.
Saw that. Overgrown vermin's broke another trap.
You also gain reputation by unlocking the map, so that encourages exploration in a fairly organic way. Later on, you also get Nightmare Dungeon keys that you can use for some extra challenge and change of pace. And of course, you may also know that there are Hell Tides, the Pit, and some other mechanics as well, but those things are locked off till after the campaign, so we're going to ignore those for now. Those being locked, however, does hint at an issue that I've discovered with the game's approach to difficulty, in that nearly all the game's difficult content is locked to post-campaign, so even though you have so many options of things to do to level up, there's not a lot of incentive to actually do so. So let's talk about difficulty. This has become quite the personal bugbear of mine, especially in the way that it's developed since release. On my past videos, I got a number of comments that D4 is too easy, essentially it's a total cakewalk. And well, that struck me as a bit odd at first, because from my memory, I've always been able to get a fair bit of challenge from the game. I was always able to control the difficulty by pushing ahead to higher world tiers, and when I wanted to really test my limits, I'd pop the absolute highest level Nightmare Dungeon I could without being instantly one-shot and just see if I can get through it. This was a sort of dynamic approach to difficulty that I truly loved about the game. But I forgot that a lot of that was thanks to me being able to skip the campaign, and more importantly, almost all of those dynamic systems were completely squashed with the Vessel of Hatred expansion. See, before Vessel of Hatred, enemies scaled to your level. And now, I know that got a lot of criticism, but what people usually forget is that it only scaled up to your level. Things never scaled down to you. This meant that enemy levels would never drop below yours, but you could always go to an area that was above your level, and the enemies there would be more challenging. Strongholds, for example, had levels that were set above what you would usually start that world tier at, so you could wait until your level matched the zone, or go there early to see if your build can handle it. And then you had capstone dungeons, which also had set levels that you could challenge early, and if you beat them, you could then increase the world tier, which would increase the difficulty of the entire world, which means that if you had done this early, well now the whole world is over-leveled, and everything's challenging until you work your way back up again. It gave the game a real dynamic ebb and flow to its difficulty that I just couldn't get anywhere else. With the release of Vessel of Hatred, however, They changed it so that enemies no longer have levels at all, and there are no world tiers. Instead, it's just a hard set difficulty level, so that enemies are always matched to you and then modified by the difficulty setting. So you can choose your difficulty, but it's all flat. All monsters are the same, with the sole exception being the pit, but like I said, that's locked to endgame. They even got rid of the levels and tiers of nightmare dungeons. So truly, there's no real challenge during the campaign. At character creation, you're able to choose up to hard difficulty. But truthfully, hard is really more like normal. And you can bump it up to expert, but you have to do that after the opening section of the game. And I wouldn't be surprised if most players don't even realize that that's something they can do, and they just continue playing the game on hard or what I consider normal, possibly even easy. I played on expert for this playthrough, like I usually do, and enemies felt a bit harder at first, but as soon as I had some legendaries and some semblance of a build synergy, the challenge was gone again for the rest of the game. And I should point out that I never followed guides, and in this playthrough I actually hardly ever even paid attention to what aspects I had on my legendaries. I would have loved to bump up the difficulty again, but for some reason they lock off penitent difficulty during the campaign. I seriously don't understand this. If you want to lock off torments, maybe that's fine, but if I want to challenge myself on penitent, then just let me do so. A quick editor's note here. It's been announced that capstone dungeons and some new enemy AI tweaks are being added to Season 11, so the overall difficulty may change with that, but I'm still a bit skeptical because what I've heard through interviews, it sounds like they understand that players want a challenge, but it doesn't sound like they necessarily understand the sort of dynamic ebb and flow and difficulty, which I feel was the game's major strength before, so I don't know how much those are going to address what I've said in this video. I feel like another thing that's changed since the original's release is the overall atmosphere of the game. The D4 campaign is one of the most memorable campaigns I've played, and I have fond memories of playing it for the first time at release. But I feel like the darker, grittier Diablo that they were shooting for at that time has been slowly shifting to a more hyper-saturated style, with very showy UI and aesthetics that somewhat cheapened the experience, at least for me. So, where do I stand now? Well, first, let me say that I think about 80% of what I said in my original comparison video still stands. Even though there have been some updates and balance reworks for both games, the respective design philosophy remains largely the same. PoE2 leans into complex and sometimes cryptic systems where progress opens up the more time and effort you invest into learning its mechanics. D4, on the other hand, has a more curated and straightforward approach, where progression, crafting, and upgrades are largely more deterministic, so you can reliably feel yourself getting stronger without much friction. That being said, for myself, coming back to D4 has been a bit of a mixed bag. I definitely had fun clearing the campaign again, and despite initially being a bit put off by the kind of transition from going from PoE2 back to D4 with its more limited skills and customization options, once I got into it, I found myself enjoying the game, and playing the campaign rekindled a lot of my interest in the world and story of Diablo. But nonetheless, I didn't feel much desire after that to continue playing, and I ended up quickly going back to PoE2 for its endgame. I've yet to find anything really compelling about the Diablo 4 endgame loop, and usually I just find myself rolling up a new character, blasting them to max level, and repeating. And honestly, that's a lot of fun, especially because of how you can skip the campaign and how you can experiment with lots of different types of content to find your own personal style for leveling. But having already done this at least twice, if not 4 or more times with every class, I think that the novelty of trying to level an alt is starting to run a bit thin. I've seriously enjoyed it for hundreds of hours, so I've more than got my money's worth. But as for now, I think I'm going to take a break, at least until they add a new class or maybe an expansion or some other major change to the game systems. Also, I really wish they would give more options to bump up difficulty during the campaign. I was planning to replay the campaigns at least once every expansion, but not being able to raise the difficulty beyond expert just makes it far too easy for a replay. I honestly don't see why they have to lock this stuff off. If they don't trust new players to pick the right difficulty themselves, they could at least unlock them for players who have already completed the campaign once. And lastly, and mostly for me, The biggest thing that's taking me out of the game now is just the change to difficulty, where everything has been flattened out and there is no longer any dynamic ebb and flow to the way you progress. And the thing that I used to think was the #1 advantage to Diablo 4 over other RPGs, namely the ability to immediately push ahead to harder content, has been limited by this new difficulty system where you just pick your difficulty and that's what you're at. And you can't even try hard difficulties until you've max leveled your character to unlock the pit and to go through the endgame loop. Anyways, that's my general thoughts for now. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, live boldly and be creative.